Good morning. After the youth, after John's song, why do you need me? Oh, thank you. I love you. I love being here. And actually, I have to be here because I started a story last time I was here and I never finished it. Who remembers that? Okay, great. Many of you shared that with me. Thank you for that. And the truth is, I probably would not have remembered it till I was halfway home. But ever since then, I have thought of nothing else. I have thought about unfinished stories. I have thought about what John just sang about, of the stories that we've been told. But what's the story of our soul that we have stopped telling? That through our culture and our religions and our politics and our society, which has somehow morphed us into something other than our greater truth. So, I'm going to start the story again that I told 3 weeks ago, and I promise to finish it. Some of you may remember, once upon a time, there was a team, a football team, and it was the University of Michigan in 1901, who wasn't doing so well. They had been losing one game after another. And so the University of Michigan fired their coach so that they could hire someone who might actually win a game. And they hired a very quiet and unassuming man named Fielding H. Yost. And at his first press conference, he stood on the stage, he took the microphone, and he spoke to the press corps, and he said, "I have two things to say. Two things and two things only, and I won't be taking any questions." And he said, first, this team will now be undefeated. And then he said, second, the combined score of all the opposing teams will be 49 points or less for the entire year. Now, he did what he promised. He took no questions. He left the stage. He went back to the locker room where the entire football team had heard him on the loudspeaker. And when he walked into that locker room, their mouths were on the floor. They said, "What have you just set us up for? We are going to be the laughing stock of the entire world of football. We haven't won a game in almost 2 years, and now you say we're going to be undefeated? We haven't scored any points in half of our games, and now you say that all the other opposing points are only going to equal 49 points or less?" And so the coach took a piece of chalk. He wrote on the blackboard one word. And he told every person in the room, take off your jersey, take off your pads, stack them in the corner, gather here. They sat in the floor right in front of him. They read the word, and he said, until you understand this word, actually the concept of this verbalization, you can't play on this team. Well, they wanted to play. They had signed up to play. They had just told the world that they were going to play to the best of their ability and be undefeated. And so they began to study the Word. One by one, they went and got their jersey and their pads, and they went out onto the field to practice. What he said in that one concept, that one word, which was the word love, was an understanding that until you love what you do and why you do it, why even begin? Why even attempt this story? And so, interestingly enough, they did outscore their opposition 550-0 that year. And that word, that concept of love began to permeate through the whole school, through the entire student population. They began to tell that story. What an amazing group that must have graduated then, huh? So I wanted to share with you another story. I promised to finish it. It's a little story out of Fort Payne, Alabama. It only happened about 35 years ago. In Fort Payne, Alabama at that time, it was known as the sock capital of the world. Socks as in the kind you wear on your feet. And in Fort Payne, there were 150 sock mills. 150 sock mills. The entire town, that's all they did was make socks. They employed 8,000 people in this small town making socks. Actually more than one out of every 7 socks sold worldwide came out of Fort Payne, Alabama. Not out of the U.S., not out of China, out of the entire globe. Over 1 out of every 7 socks. And a few years later, as I fast forward through the story, one particular sock mill was just a moderate size. It wasn't the biggest, it wasn't the smallest. It was struggling to get by, but the owners, the Locklears, were not desperate or poor or living in poverty. They had 2 small children, Emma and Gina, and the girls really aspired to do something besides make socks. And so they began to think about what they wanted to do, and they started to talk to their parents about moving away, and their parents said, "This is the legacy that we have built for you." They actually named their sock mill after their girls. It was called the Emma G Factory, the Emma G Mill. Emma was the youngest, Gina was the oldest. And they said, "We don't want you to move away because we're kind of getting ready to hand this sock mill to you." Fast forward a few more years. The economics of our nation changed. And what ended up happening was those 150 mills ended up one by one disappearing. It got down to 80 and then to 70 and then to 50. Today, only about 15 of them are still there. And Emma did move away. She moved to Atlanta. She married a big-time attorney. Her life changed forevermore. She's still there. Gina, the youngest, had grown up playing in the sock bins. Her parents would say, "Sweep," and she would sweep for a minute, and then she'd go play in the socks again. Her parents would say, "Go clean this, or go dust that, or go learn how to run this machine," and she would go play in the socks. And there was a gentleman who was there. His name was Vance Veal. And will you advance that slide for me? This is Gina. And if you'll advance it one more time, this is Vance. Vance became almost like this big brother to Gina. And she didn't understand what this thing called unity was all about, but Vance did. He was a student of unity. And from a time of a little girl, he would tell her that there is only one power and one presence. There is this God out there, and he liked to call it love. And he began to share with her, as a little girl, that you are an expression of that one power and presence. You are an extension of that source, our second unity principle. And as she grew up in the sock mill and saw Vance every day of her life, she began, as all little girls do, to tell stories. And he shared with her, every thought that you have is a story. Unity principle. And every thought that you hold in mind reproduces. Every story that you tell continues that story. And as the mills began to disappear, Gina had the opportunity to go off to college. Her parents said, "Maybe you should look for something else. Maybe there is no future here. And so she did. She graduated from college. She tried lots of jobs. She tried to find herself. She ended up going back to school to sell real estate. She began to show houses, and she hated it. She hated everyone that she showed a house to. She hated everything about her life, and all she wanted to do was go home. Go home to the security that she knew, and go home to hear more wisdom from Vance. And so, fast forward a little bit more. Gina had become a vegetarian and ultimately a vegan. She began to only put foods into her body that were pure. She began to only buy clothing that was organic. And one day, while she was going through the grocery store with her cart, picking out only organic things, she had a thought. What if we made socks out of organic cotton? And what if we hired a team that was conscious? And what if we branded a different kind of brand of sock that could be sold to the world? Now, all of the years that the M&G factory had been making socks, they had only made one kind of sock, a white crew sock. You'd never heard of it because it didn't even have a name. They sold it to Walmart, and Walmart named it whatever Walmart brand is. They sold it to Target, and Target's branded it however they branded it. But it was the old white crew sock that we all know and wore in gymnastics, right? And interestingly enough, on a trip home, she told her parents, what if we added a little color? What if we could use a different yarn? What if we did this intentionally? Her parents said, honey, that's a great idea, but that kind of cotton's really expensive. We've never used color. That is an entirely different process that our machines aren't set up for. None of us know how to brand. We just make socks and sell it to people who know how to brand. But Gina didn't let go of her story. And she told Vance about her story. And he said, well, I've told you that there's one power, and it's love. I've told you that you're an extension of that. I've told you that your stories reproduce as you tell them. So the next step is to take it into prayer and meditation, to sit with it, our fourth unity principle. Vance had never really talked about unity. He just lived the principles. And he said, before you actually go out and create the action of making these socks, sit in the silence and let it resonate all the more. So they did, as a family, for about 4 weeks. I'm going to fast forward through that story. Last fall, Martha Stewart named Gina's company one of the top 10 new American companies of making American products of organic material. Whole Foods called her and said, we'd like to start selling your socks. The boutiques in Manhattan, New York called her and said, we would like to start selling your socks. Europe called her and said, we would like to sell your socks. Vogue called her and said, we'd like to show your socks. The New York Times flew into Fort Payne, Alabama, and said, we'd like to do a story about you. NBC flew into town and said, we'd like to do a story about you. They dubbed her the Sock Queen of Alabama. Just Google it and read more about the story. Learn more about Vance and Gina. What I know about story is that we all have them because everything is a story. I've told you that before. You tell a story whether you know you're telling a story or not. You tell a story about your relationships, about your finances, about your health, about your direction in life. You tell a story about the person sitting beside you. You tell a person about the person sleeping next to you. But it's all just a story. Matter of fact, I like to say you've never met anyone, you've only ever met your story of them. And when they don't match that story, your emotional guidance system is all out of whack. In Unity, we have been telling a story for many years. It is our third basic Unity principle, that thoughts held in mind produce after their kind. You know that story. You've said that story. Some stories become stagnant. Have you noticed? If you just tell them over and over and over, they fall flat after a while. So in Unity today, we are beginning to notice that some of those catchphrases, like thoughts held in mind produce after their kind, have become a little bit stagnant. They make sense, they're true, and they're a little boring. So we are upping our game. We're telling a new story, and the new story is this: thoughts and feelings held in consciousness produce and reproduce in consciousness. The reason we're telling that story differently is this. The old story is one of holding thoughts in mind. Where do we think mind lives? You automatically think right here. But the truth is, mind is all through us. Mind is another word for consciousness. And so if we use the word consciousness in a new light, we see things in a new light. And we know now that it's not just thoughts, but it's the thoughts and feelings that are attached. It's our feelings that are moving us, that are guiding us in one direction or another. And because consciousness lives in every cell of our being, we understand today that those thoughts, those feelings, those emotions that live in every cell of our being are creating and recreating and telling and retelling the story. It has been a very literal interpretation for many years, and sometimes it's oversimplified a very complex and dynamic truth principle. It was called the law of mind action, but somehow it has morphed into what we are now seeing as the law of mime action. And so we are telling the story, the same story, a little differently, freshening it up. Interestingly enough, last time I was here, I told you I was leaving this stage and going to Unity Village. I had a friend with me. Her name was Rhonda. Many of you met her. We just sang a couple of great Methodist songs. Rhonda is Methodist, so imagine her surprise when she walked into the Unity bookstore at Unity Village and saw all these books about consciousness. And she pulled out a book that many of you know. It's called The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. Anyone here read it? Know it? Rhonda had never heard of it. And so we were at the village for a couple of days. I had some speaking gigs to do there. And as we were driving back to Oklahoma, she pulled out her book. I was driving. She was going to read a little bit. And she began to ask a question here and there. And I just began to tell the story of the book. Pretty soon I noticed the book's not open anymore because I'm just telling her all about the book. Telling her all about the Four Agreements and the fifth one. And she said, I get this here. I want to get it here. And I said, okay, well, let's practice it. Let's just talk about the story and notice that it's going to produce and reproduce in the coming days, knowing that it will. So she put the book away. We chatted about it a little more, and then we chatted about other things. Long story short, I had been at Unity Village to speak for a few different occasions, and I also went into the Unity online radio studios to record a couple of my shows. My producer there, who I don't see often, grabbed me in the hallway and said, Chaz, I need to talk to you, but I don't have time. I've got to run to a meeting. So watch your email. I'm going to email you something. I said, great. Rhonda and I get home. I had forgotten that my producer had even mentioned that. I open up my email at midnight that night, and he had emailed me and said, we have had an email from the publisher of the Four Agreements, and Don Miguel Ruiz is going to allow Unity to do one more interview on the Four Agreements, and you've been chosen. I called Rhonda at midnight and said, it didn't even take a few days. This is what happens when we tell and retell the story, when we get into the vibration and into the alignment of something, when we create and recreate and co-create. You know, on your bulletin today is a verse from Romans. Be not fashioned according to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. I would call that, if I were writing it today, I would say by the renewing and the renewing and the renewing and the renewing of your mind. The telling and the retelling and the retelling and the retelling of your story. I want you to think for just a moment about the story you've been telling about your finances. What's the story you've been telling about your health and well-being? What's the story you've been telling about your relationships? What's the story you've been telling about your career? What's the story you've been telling about your spiritual path? What's the story you've been telling about this church, this city, this world? Everything, every thought is a story. It's another word for prayer. And so knowing that means we know that we are always telling stories. So if you're going to tell a story, and you are, why are you not making it a really good story? Why are you not making it a story about your worthiness and your well-being, about your prosperity and abundance? Because every thought becomes a prayer. Every vibration that comes forth from you is one that you step into. It's a story you step into. You can do that meekly or boldly. We've been taught over the course of time to create our lives by hacking away at this frozen, icy block of a physical reality. We put all of our focus on the things that we don't like in our lives, and we try to chip away at them, to create, to hope, to pray that if we work really hard at carving out the imperfections of our existence, then we will eventually manifest this masterpiece. That's what John just sang about. That's really backwards thinking, isn't it? Didn't you come forth to create? Didn't you come forth knowing that you are creating your reality moment by moment, breath by breath, day by day? But over the course of time, through religion, through culture, through society, through politics, through many avenues of life, we have learned things that are opposite of truth. We have become things that we were never meant to become. And so we must unlearn that which is not true. We must unbecome that which we know isn't in alignment with our truth. We must unbelieve that which we have been taught to believe. There's an old saying, I'll believe it when I see it, but the truth is, you'll see it when you believe it. And our thoughts, when unquestioned, become our beliefs, and those beliefs become our reality. That's just the natural order of things. And the stories we make up in the thought process are often full of untruths. They limit us, and yet we know as spiritual beings live in this human existence, we are unlimited. If we could come back to that knowing, to that intersection of the thoughts and feelings that we are holding in every cell of our being, that vibration can become more dominant when we practice it more deliberately, then perhaps we can unbecome and then become. Rumi said, that which you want wants you. That which you desire desires you. When you take the word become and you break it up and you throw it in the mirror, it is coming to be. That which you are desiring and holding and vibrating is coming to be. And so, the story of life, the story of love, the story that we have all at some point in our life existence told, may have become a rather stale and stagnant story. I want you to think about your own story this morning and think about how true it is. The author of the book, The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari, is that a great title of a book or what? Named Robin Sharma said this: everything is created twice, first in mind and then in reality. Stephen Covey said all things are created twice, first mentally and then physically. Our co-founder Charles Fillmore said a prayer without desire in it is a prayer without sincerity in it. A prayer without soul in it is a prayer without spirit in it. And that prayer is fruitless. Once it's in mind, it comes to life at the level of consciousness. And so, this morning, I want to share the end of that coach story. Wasn't it Paul Harvey who said the rest of the story? The rest of that story of the University of Michigan goes like this. They did end up winning every game that year. They did end up surprising themselves. But what they ended up with the most was the understanding that to play on Yost's team, they had to line up with love. They had to love the game. They had to love the practice. They had to love the sweat. They had to love the sore muscles. They had to love the pressure. They had to love the performance. They had to love the determination in their opponent's eyes who were coming to take them out. They had to love it all. And so, over the course of that year, they began to love in a new way. And during the next year, they were undefeated. The next year, they were undefeated. The next year, they were undefeated. The next year, they were 5 years running, they were undefeated. And they ended up outscoring their opponents in 5 years by a total score of 2,821 to 49. Just as he had said. They earned themselves the nickname Point a Minute, because when they did the math, they did a point every minute. So whether it's an unwanted circumstance that happens to us or something that we initiate voluntarily, change is inevitable, isn't it? It's the only constant in life. It's also the choice. It's a consciousness of choice to change your mind, to change your story, to evolve. On the back of your program is your mission statement, and I notice that it says that you empower each other to be authentically all that you came here to be. It's right there in black and white. All that you came here to be, and all that you are becoming. After I got home, after I called Rhonda and told her the story at midnight, I ended up having to leave and go back out of town for a few more speaking engagements. I was gone for a few days, and when I returned, I started to open my door, and I couldn't get it open. I have a mail slot in my door where all the mail and packages come through. And because I'd been gone a few days, it had really piled up. And so I was trying to push that out of the way, and I've got all my bags on trying to make room. And I saw a package there, a big fluffy package. I didn't think anything about it because, I'm an Amazon Prime member, so it's not anything new to get packages. And I put everything in the corner, I unpacked, I got settled, and I was going to go through the mail, and I opened that big fluffy package. It was from my business partner, Ann Leach, who I'm going to see in just a few hours. She lives in Joplin. Ann had sent me a package. It was actually my Christmas present, only 6 weeks late. And she had put on the note, I don't know why, but these spoke your name. It was a pair of socks. And interestingly enough, the ones of all the colors and all the sayings on the socks, the one she sent to me says story. I'd been thinking about this unfinished story and how to step into a new story in life. Now I get to literally step into a story. Albert Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing something over and over again and expecting a different result. If you want your story to be magnificent and full of love and grace, then you have to realize you are the author of that story. And every new breath and every new moment and every new day is a new page. This is the start of a new day. It's the start of a new story. This is the part of your story where your page meets mine. And no matter where your tale takes you or where it came from, let us be aligned with the truth that this and all stories of truth are great love stories. Thank you. Namaste.